All right, if you have your Bibles, let's return to Genesis chapter 18. We're going to talk about Abraham this morning and some visitors that Abraham got. Some unexpected folks that came into his life. When we went to Promise Keepers, we went a day early so that we could take some time and see the Capitol. And we tried to do that, and it took so long that it wasn't until after dark that we got to the White House. And so we went to the White House expecting to see different things. I expected maybe to see Bill and Hillary on the back porch, sipping lemonade with Al and Tipper maybe. You just get close and see them out there. But we found some things at the White House we didn't expect. Found a parking place that was nearby. That was one thing we found. And also there were kids skateboarding through cones right out in front of the White House. They seemed to be welcome there. Any of them could have been a terrorist with Uzis, shooting at the White House off skateboards for all I could see. But they were welcome doing all their little things. And we sat there and we looked at the White House. Dark, nobody out there. But then we looked on top of the White House, and these shadowy figures were up there. I didn't know that people walked on top of the White House. And I'd been there years ago and didn't see anybody on top of the White House, but at least for this administration, they had got security people walking all along the roof of the White House in black clothing where you could barely just see them in the shadows. And we got the binoculars out. Tony had binoculars. And we looked at them, and they quickly looked at us when we were looking at binoculars at them. They got interested in who was at the gate when we were doing that. But totally unexpected what I would find at the White House. You don't come to my house and see people walking the roof and people skateboarding in front through cones without anybody saying anything about it. Just a whole different atmosphere than what I expected. Well, here's Abraham. We find him today in chapter 18. The heat of the day. It's hot. He's sitting there like he sat there day and day before, probably during the warmer season. And he's just trying to find some shade. Not many trees in Canaan, and so his tent was his primary place of comfort. And he's sitting there, and underneath the tree, the tent was probably underneath these great trees of Mamre. And while he's sitting there, 3 visitors show up. And he immediately notices them. This is obviously a low traffic area. You don't see bunches of people passing by. So when 3 men showed up at his tent, he immediately noticed it and reacted to it. Verse 1 says, the Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. That description, the Lord appeared, is something that is given to us, and then the chapter is going to describe how it unfolded. Abraham didn't look up and say, well, there's the Lord. He didn't know that, but as the chapter is rewritten for us, this is given as an introductory sentence, and then it's the description of how Abraham came to understand who had appeared to him that day is given to us through the rest of the chapter. It says, Abraham looked up and he saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them, and he bowed low to the ground. 3 men's all that Abraham knew when he first saw them. We're going to find out later that one of them is the Lord, and the 2 others are angels. Because the next chapter describes the 2 angels going on to Sodom while the Lord stood or stayed with Abraham for a while. So that's who it was. Abraham looked at them and just saw 3 people. We're told in Hebrews that we entertain angels unaware that they come very much looking like people. And yet they have that ability to do that in the service of God, to take on the form or the appearance of people as they do the ministry that God has called them to. So maybe a couple of you guys are angels and you just haven't told us yet, but they can very much take on that form. And that's what happened here with Abraham. 3 men. We're going to find out they're not men at all. Abraham reacted to them in a very customary way. Hospitality was something that was very important. If you were not hospitable, if you did not show hospitality to somebody, I don't want to search for that word right now. If you didn't show hospitality to somebody, it was something that came very strong against your name. You were expected, if you were a good person, to be hospitable there to somebody. because they didn't have Holiday Inns, they didn't have Ramadas and Best Westerns back then. If somebody was very vulnerable, if they were traveling on the road, if somebody would not take them in, or a town would not embrace them and give them protection for that night, they were in a very dangerous position. So Abraham, one who had traveled much himself, knew what that was like, and so he immediately ran toward them. It says he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them, and he bowed low to the ground. They must have had an appearance that was impressive. Whether he knew who they were or not, they had an aura about them that must have impacted him. And he came up to them, and he said, "If I found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by." He says to them, and this is the only usage here when the word Lord is there, Adonai or Adonai is the word that is used there. It kind of draws out of the word Adam, which means man, so it's an exalted sense of man, calling them Lord, like somebody who's, it's a term of respect for them, but it's not at all saying the Lord who is God. He comes to them and just recognizes them in a very respectful way and asks them not to pass by the servant. "Let a little water be brought, and then you may wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so that you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." So here Abraham is very aggressive in his response to these folks. And he teaches us a great lesson of how we should respond to the Lord. The first idea that we should carry as we respond to other people is we should do it personally. Here's Abraham, who was 99 years old. He had a lot of good reason to just sit there in the rocking chair. And a wealthy man, had 300 servants. He could have just said, "Why don't you get over there and help them? Why don't you do this for that?" But it says here that he hurried over to them and began to show respect to them and began to try to meet the needs that a traveler would have who was traveling in that time in world history. They would obviously be hungry. There weren't any McDonald's along the road. If they would have to find somewhere where they could have food, they would be thirsty. The heat of the day would certainly bring on a thirst. They didn't have an ice chest on a camel with a lot of ice down pop or water there. They would need to be restocked and refreshed as often as somebody's generosity would allow that to happen. So Abraham responds quickly to that need. So he was very personal in being willing to do that. And he did it immediately. It says here he hurried. It's going to say that he ran. It says in verse 6 that Abraham hurried into his tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, get 3 seals of fine flour and knead it and bake some bread." 3 seals of fine flour, that's 20 quarts probably of flour. Quickly do this. And this was not, Sarah couldn't go over to her microwave in her kitchen and set the buttons on it and put in a prepared thing and stick it in there. This demanded a lot of effort that they were willing to go through to meet the needs of these obviously impressive visitors that they had. But Abraham was willing to do that. Here's a 99-year-old man running. I go jogging a lot, but I don't see many 99-year-old men out there on the jogging track running. In Washington, D.C., everybody, I think, in the world that lives there was jogging. You'd get run over if you didn't keep, looking in all 4 directions. They were jogging or riding bikes. But not a one of them looked like they were 99 years old. But Abraham is willing to respond to the needs that he sees there by hurrying, asking Sarah to be quick about meeting the needs as far as baking bread. It says he ran to the herd to select a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He is constantly trying to do as quickly what he can for the needs that he sees. We need to learn a few things from Abraham. Often we do God's work. We don't do it in a personal way. We try to maybe pay for it to be done by others rather than recognizing that God has called us to specific tasks in the church, and that those tasks are to be done as quickly as we have the ability to do it. It's not things we should continually put off, but we should hurry. We should do them as quickly as we can so that God can entrust us with another opportunity to serve Him. This one little phrase here, "Do not pass me by, your servant." And he is saying that probably to a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus Christ. He is saying that, do not pass me by, your servant. How many times in the church do we see people saying, well, maybe next year I'll serve. Go ahead and pass me by for this year, and maybe next time around I'll try to get on that committee. Or next time around maybe I can help you teach that class. Abraham should teach us that the opportunities to serve God are great blessings. That God would even allow us that opportunity is something so wonderful. And we should stand before God and say, God, do not pass me by. Give me another opportunity. Give me this opportunity. But so many believers today are saying, well, I'll wait for a later time. I'll wait till I feel more equipped or more comfortable with that. When God has singled them out for a certain opportunity of service. And so many are allowing days and weeks, opportunities to pass them by. Abraham reacted personally, he reacted immediately, and he reacted generously. He wanted the finest flour to be prepared for them. He went out and got the tender choice calf. He didn't get the one that looked like it was going to die maybe in the next week anyway. He got the best that he had to offer for them. And we need to give that to God. We need to give God not our leftovers. We need to understand what God needs from us and be willing to give the best that we have. Give the best time of the morning. Give the best energies we have. To give the first fruits instead of the leftover fruit to God. Abraham understood that. He gave the best that he had, knowing that that was his responsibility as a servant. And a fourth thing is he did it humbly. When he first met them, he ran out to them and he bowed low to the ground. All through this, he describes himself as your servant. When he finally got everything prepared for them and he presented it to them, he didn't even eat with them. He stood back away from them and he allowed them to eat there while he stood. And he watched. He showed humility. And here was a man that had just a few chapters back raised a great army out of the servants in his own household and gone and defeated 4 kings and brought back an abundance of booty, an abundance of captives, an abundance of people who had been captured. And Abraham had done all these things, and yet he shows himself as a servant. And we like to think of all the things that we've done and exalt ourselves and so build pride into our lives. And because of that, we're unwilling to humble ourselves as God would have us to humble ourselves. Humility is what we are, what the reality is between us and God. When we humble ourselves, it's our recognition of what's already true. If we want to be prideful, we are fighting against the truth. We're living a lie. When we humble ourselves, we're recognizing who we are before God. And God says that those who humble themselves, He will exalt them at the proper time. We put ourselves in a position where God can exalt us. And God can exalt me a lot better than I can exalt myself. He can bring a lot more blessing into my life than I can provide for myself. So Abraham did all these things in his service to God. He serving, whether he understood it was God directly at that time, but he certainly understood this was an important guest. And in his responsibility to God, he was serving them in a way that we are to serve others as we would serve Christ. And he was doing this as he would to God. Well, while he was standing there, watching them, and my kids, you can always tell a guilty conscience when you watch somebody or watch one of the kids eat, especially if they're kind of just picking at it. They'll look at you and they'll say, why? He's just watching them eat. All the things that must have been going through his mind as he began to look at them and think, there's something unusual about these guys. And finally, these guys responded back to him. In fact, the Lord said this, "Where's your wife, Sarah?" And Abraham said, "Well, she's in the tent." Then the Lord said, a brand new name here, Jehovah. We got Lord in 2 different places, but it's a different word. This is the word Jehovah. The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Bingo. We go right back to the chapter before that, with a revelation that he would be the father was connected with the revelation that she would be the mother was first made. And now these three visitors come. As Abraham had stood before God in the last chapter, and God had communicated that to him, now these three visitors let down their guard and show who they are by making that very same statement. And it says here that Sarah was listening. You can see Sarah at the side of the tent with maybe a glass jar up against it, listening to all this being said out there. And she hears this. I guess Abraham hadn't shared this with her. I think that would be something she'd have wanted to know by now. And these three guys share it with her, probably for the first time. And it says here that she was listening at the entrance of the tent, and they were already old, past childbearing years, 99 and 89. So Sarah laughed to herself. It says, for she thought, after I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure? Will I now be able to have a child? But I haven't been able to have a child for 89 years. When I should be a grandmother, am I now going to be a mother for the first time? She laughed to herself. She didn't laugh out loud. She didn't beller and laugh where everybody could hear her. We went to, me and Katie and her friend went to Annie's Santa Fe the other night. We got this coupon book, and we were saving money every chance we get. And it just seemed to be one of those times when everything was funny, especially to those two. And they were laughing out loud about everything. One of them would laugh and throw their head back and bump it, and then it would be about twice as funny about that. The whole restaurant knew that we were there. But Sarah didn't laugh like that at all. She just kind of inside found humor in a statement that she would actually be a mom. Now, we just don't have many baby showers in adult 3. I mean, it's just a fact of life that we don't do that. That's beyond. That's past the normal way of doing things. But God told Sarah for the first time, and when she heard this magnificent news, her reaction was to laugh. And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Abraham didn't hear this. She laughed to herself. He's probably thinking, I'm 99 years old, now my hearing is gone because I didn't hear that at all. But God knew exactly what she had thought, and to think it is to say it as far as between ourselves and God. To think something is the same as actually doing it. Jesus teaches us in the Sermon on the Mount, and she had thought it, she had laughed to herself, and that was the same as doing it out loud to the Lord. And he asked Abraham, why did she do that? And laughed at the idea that she would have a child. And then he makes a statement here that's very consistent with a statement that's been made other places in Scripture. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Mary was presented with the idea that she would give birth to the Savior of the world. And she said, how can this be since I've never known a man? And the response of the angel was, nothing is impossible to God. Nothing is impossible. Nothing is too difficult for the Lord. An 89-year-old lady with a 99-year-old husband can have a child if God's in it, just like an older teen girl without a husband can bring a child into this world if God so desires it to happen. Nothing is impossible to God. Well, Sarah, it says in verse 15, Sarah was afraid and she lied. You ever gotten afraid and lied? I can just see fear sometimes in my kids, the fear of the truth, and the lie pops out there, and just the whole demeanor of it all says, well, they just lied. They're afraid and they lied. And sometimes you even know what the truth is before you present them with it, and you can see them kind of bristle and say, if I tell the truth, I'm going to die. So I'd better just hope that the lie makes it this time. That is human nature, sin nature, but it is human nature. And Sarah was presented with the Lord speaking to her and asking her, why did you laugh at that statement and say that you're too old for God to bring this about in your life? It said she lied and said, I did not laugh. And he said, oh yeah, you did laugh. You can't fool God. And God's not going to be snowed over by your denying that you did a certain thing. God knows everything And you don't need to play games with God, because God knows exactly what you have done outwardly and inwardly as well. So Sarah was presented with an unbelievable truth of what God was going to do. Abraham responded to these three visitors in a way that was very respectful and a way that God could bless him in. Part of that blessing that God was going to bring into their lives was that they would have a child together. And after that revelation, then the two angels, two of the men that he saw there, and now he understands completely who the other one is. But the two of them left. And it says when the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. And then Jehovah said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just." God has chosen Abraham. He's going to have all these things happen in his life. And because God has chosen him, it says here that he shall direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. Are you chosen by God? That's part of your responsibility. It's for your household to be directed to follow God as well. So that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Part of what God uses to bring about what he has promised to bless you with is the consistency of household after household, of generation after generation. If we see generations beginning to throw out the spiritual truths of a generation before them, it hinders and cripples what's on the heart of God to see fulfilled in the descendants of that person to which he originally promised it. You know, God needed to maintain a household of faithfulness to himself. And through the history of Israel, you can see that was pretty difficult. They got real rebellious, and God had to bring them back to judgments and revivals and all these things to try to keep them, at least a remnant of them, on the straight line, so that these promises could continue to be their hope. Then the Lord said this. He said, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great that their sin is so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know." He goes from a promise of blessing to a promise or certainty of judgment. Obviously, the Lord knew exactly what was going on in Sodom, but this was a moment where he would present himself, his angels going there, to them as a last opportunity for them to do what is right and to get things turned around. So this was that last hope that they had. And it says the men turned away and they went towards Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. So you know judgment is coming. When the two guys start walking towards Sodom, now we don't know if judgment is about to hit this earth, if the angels are on their way, and we cannot see that from our vantage point. Abraham could see them. He was standing in the gap with the Lord, standing right there before the Lord, and he saw judgment making its way toward Sodom. Those two men were closing in on it. He knew the time and the hour, and that encouraged him to be about prayer. We don't know the time and the hour, but we should know that time and the hour is promised, and we shouldn't waste an opportunity to pray. It could be closer than what Abraham had given to him, knowing what a journey it would take to get to Sodom. Now, we don't know if judgment is on its way. Daniel prayed for 21 days. In 21 days, there was a conflict in heaven before the angel could come and give him the answer to that prayer. Now, we don't know what the time frame is, but judgment may be making its way closer and closer and closer and be very, very imminent. Well, here's Abraham standing before the Lord. He's been given the message of what God does for the righteous, what God does for those he wants to bless. And then the Lord tells him judgment's going to hit Sodom and Gomorrah. And so he immediately turns his attention as he's standing before the Lord to interceding for Sodom and Gomorrah. Because Lot is in Sodom. His brother's son is living with his family in Sodom. So Abraham begins to petition. And this is what he says. He approaches God on what he knows to be true about God. He says, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of 50 righteous people in it? He knows the answer to that. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of the earth do what is right? Are you going to let, if you got this group of righteous people there, you're going to let them go down with the ship just because they're surrounded by wicked people? In Abraham's mind, he couldn't see that happening. And so that's the way he approaches God. Surely there's 50 people that are righteous down there. Maybe he started thinking, well, wait a minute, that's a pretty sick place. Maybe I better work my way down from that 50. And he comes back to the Lord and says, what about 45? What about 40? He's moving by fives. Then he's getting a little confident here because each time the reaction is the same and saying, no, I will spare it if I can find 45. I'll spare it if I can find 40. Then he starts going by tens. What about 30? If you find 30 there, I'll spare it if I find 30 there. What about 20? What about 10? He must have felt pretty comfortable when he got to 10. Because Lot and his wife were 2. Lot's 2 daughters were 4. I'm sure he knew the news that their daughters were going to get married, and he knew Lot wouldn't let them marry anybody that wasn't appropriate. So that would make 6. And if just Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters would have won one person to God since they had been there, well, that'd make 10. So he had the confidence that he could stop right there. So when he mentioned 10, he said, let me speak one more time. And he petitioned for God to spare a whole city just because of 10 believers that were there. Now, some things that this teaches us. Number one is that Abraham, living in the trees of Mamre, knew more about Sodom than Sodom did. Because Abraham was walking with God. And when he was walking with God, the secret of the Lord is with those who serve the Lord. And when a person walks with God, God puts burdens upon them, and he puts his secrets into their life to let them know what they need to pray for, to give them an idea of what's around the corner so that they can prepare adequately for it. And Abraham knew more about Sodom than anybody in Sodom did. He knew more about their future. He knew more about what was going to happen. Lot lived there. Lot lived on Main Street in Sodom. But Abraham, way up in the countryside, knew more about Sodom because he was walking with God than Lot did, who was communing down there with the wicked people in Sodom. The second thing is that we find here, as we're going to find out tonight, there weren't 10 in Sodom. In fact, there may have only been 1 in Sodom. Because every other one that got out of there alive because of their tie to Lot exposed a wickedness in their heart, which was more characteristic of the unrighteous than the righteous. The second thing we need to face this morning is there may be a lot less believers than we think. There may be a lot less true believers than we think. Abraham optimistically started at 50, worked his way down to a comfortable 10, and he was still wrong. We look at this world and we see that there are lots of people in churches. There are lots of people who tag themselves Christian. There are lots of people who respond to polls saying, I believe in God. I believe in a heaven. But there may be a lot less actually in heaven than what we think. Because the issue is not appreciating God. The issue is not wanting to go to hell. The issue is a sin issue. And a lot of people won't sacrifice pride in their life to deal with that sin issue where God says to deal with it. They won't humble themselves like Abraham did and get before God and ask God to forgive them and cleanse them of their sin. They'll tell God they think a lot of Him, but they won't say they think little of themselves. And that is what the criteria is. So the second truth is there may be a lot less. Not only when you're walking with God do you know a lot more than the world does, but the second truth is that there may be a lot less who really know God. And the third truth is, and this is something we all need to consider, is there is a cost to a wasted witness. I don't know how much time Lot had there. He had probably over a decade in this land. And yet, after all that time, it's just him. He's the only believer that is there. He's obviously not had any kind of aggressive witness that was there. In fact, his witness was so watered down that his own family hadn't even responded. They weren't even aggressive for serving God. The cost of a wasted witness. If he would only have a congregation of 10, and in the Jewish mind, just 10 men made a synagogue. That's all you needed to start a church, was just 10 men and their families that would come along after them. He didn't even have the 10 with the families included. After all that time there, we're going to find out tonight that he had made some grounds in civic government, but he hadn't made any ground in the eternal issues for God. What is the cost of maybe the wasted witness in your life? We look at Christ today and we see what he did for us on the cross, and we can see that the righteous, it was totally reversed. The righteous died for all the wicked. In this judgment, the wicked are going to die, and the righteous will be pulled out and delivered. But when Christ came, he died, the only one, so that the wicked might have a hope. When you look at your family, when you look at the opportunities that you've had this past week, you might ask yourself, are you more like Abraham or are you more like Lot? Are you communing with God? Do you know the burdens that are on the heart of God? Do you know the secrets that God is whispering into the ear of those who are his servants? And are you praying for those things? Are you interceding for those? Or are you like Lot, that every day goes by and by and by and is wasted for the purpose of God? And Lot had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that judgment was going to happen to his very town, because he wasn't walking with God, and he was wasting every day of a witness that God had so graciously given him the responsibility for. Would you bow with me?